The moment that many Americans realize that the Articles of Confederation are not going to work is Shays' Rebellion. Now, this was a farmers' rebellion that broke out in Massachusetts during the second half of 1786 and lasted into the early part of 1787. Now, remember, under the Articles of Confederation, the national government could not raise taxes, the national government could not raise an army. These were things that state governments could do, but not the national government. Now, Massachusetts had acquired quite a bit of debt during the American Revolution. Keep in mind, there was a lot of fighting in Massachusetts during the American Revolution. Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, the siege of Boston, all of this took place in Massachusetts. And in order to pay off these debts, the Massachusetts state government raised some fairly heavy taxes. Well, in western Massachusetts, you had farmers who were barely making enough to get by with, to begin with, and when they start getting hit with these taxes, many of them are not, or they simply can't afford to pay them. And so the state government starts to seize their property. Now, if you lost your property during this time period, this meant that you were no longer able to vote. You had to be a landowner if you wanted to vote. This also meant that your property was sold to pay off your debts. And if you could not pay off your debts, if that was not enough, then you went to debtor's prison. So in western Massachusetts, you have farmers who are losing their property, they're being sent to debtor's prison, and many of them, they're paying more in taxes now than they had under British rule. So you're starting to see some of these farmers question, why did I even fight for independence if this is the result? Now, these farmers actually petition the Massachusetts state government, and the government ignores them. So one of these farmers, a man by the name of Daniel Shays, he decides, okay, well, we tried it the legal way, and that didn't work, so let's try it the illegal way. So he raises an army of farmers and leads them against the Massachusetts state government. Their first target is the courthouses. Now, why would they attack courthouses? Well, if the courthouse is shut down, then you can't have trials. And without trials and hearings, you can't seize people's property and send them to debtor's prison. So Shays and his followers travel from town to town, shutting down the courthouses. And back in Boston, the state government was becoming increasingly worried. They weren't sure how they were going to end this rebellion. So they asked the national government for troops, and of course the national government replied, well, we can't do that. We don't have the power to raise an army. Well, the governor managed to put together a force of militia, about 4,000 militiamen, and they managed to stop the rebellion before it got completely out of control. After shutting down the courthouses, the farmers were actually planning on going to Springfield, Massachusetts, where there was an arsenal. This is just a building full of weapons. Once they captured this arsenal, the plan was to go to Boston and burn Boston to the ground. Well, the governor managed to get this militia together, get them to Springfield, and they were standing in front of the arsenal once Shays and his men arrived. As Shays' men approached the arsenal, the militia fired shots over their heads. They kept coming, and the militia commander, very reluctantly, ordered his men to fire directly at the farmers. 4 of them were killed, several others were wounded, and this ended the rebellion. Now, I want you to look at this picture for just a moment. These are the farmers who are in rebellion. This is the arsenal that they are trying to capture. Look how close they come to succeeding. Now, we don't know for sure that they could or could not have been stopped once they captured the arsenal. But once they had acquired all of these weapons and even cannons that were stored inside the building, I personally think it's pretty unlikely that they could have been stopped. So this is a pretty good representation of just how close they came to succeeding. And this got a lot of American leaders thinking, what if this was the British? What if the British reinvaded? What if another country reinvaded? Would we be able to stop them? You know, we barely stopped a bunch of farmers armed with clubs and pitchforks. So this causes a lot of people to think we need to make some serious changes to the Articles of Confederation. At the same time that Shays' Rebellion is taking place, there is a meeting in Annapolis, Maryland. The purpose of this meeting was to discuss possible changes to the Articles. Well, as I stated in the previous part of this lesson, in order to amend the Articles, you have to have agreement amongst all 13 of the states. It doesn't matter if 12 states vote yes. If one state votes no, then the amendment fails. Well, only 5 states even show up to this meeting. But before they leave, one of the delegates from New York, Alexander Hamilton, stands up and says, I propose that we meet next May of 1787, in Philadelphia. And there, we need to make sure that we get all 13 states together and discuss making some kind of serious changes to the Articles. Well, some people are opposed to this idea, but George Washington, who you might recall is in retirement at Mount Vernon at this point in time, comes out of retirement and states that if this meeting takes place, he wants to attend. Well, when George Washington speaks, people listen. So once he comes out in support of this convention, it becomes pretty apparent that it is going to happen. So in May of 1787, the convention that Hamilton proposed begins in Philadelphia. Now, from the beginning, it looks like this meeting is not going to work out. Rhode Island does not send any delegates. Every other state sends delegates except for Rhode Island. They decide to go ahead with the convention without Rhode Island, and their first act of business is to elect George Washington president of the convention. This does not mean he's president of the United States. That office does not exist yet. All this means is he sits at the front of the room, he calls the meetings to order, he taps his gavel when people get out of line, so on and so forth. So this is Independence Hall. This is the building that the Declaration of Independence was signed in Philadelphia. It still stands today. And this is also the building that the delegates who are talking about changes to the Articles of Confederation choose to meet in. At the time, it was known as the Pennsylvania State House. This is the inside. Up front is George Washington's chair. This is where he would have sat during the convention. And this is a very famous artist rendition of what the convention might have looked like. You probably recognize a few of the delegates. This is obviously George Washington, and Benjamin Franklin is seated here in the center. A few others that should be pointed out would be men like Roger Sherman, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. Okay, so I'm about to start talking about big states and little states. So as far as big states go, I'm not referring to states that are actually large in size. I'm talking about states that have a large population. And when I talk about little states, I'm talking about states with small populations. So the largest state of them all at this time is Virginia with 747,610 citizens. And there's several others. North Carolina has a pretty big population. Massachusetts, which is a fairly small state in size, has a fairly large population. Same thing for Maryland. And then on the other hand, little states include states like Georgia, which is fairly large in size but has a small population, only 82,000 people. Rhode Island with 68,000, and the smallest of them all, Delaware, with 59,096. Okay, so very early during the convention, the delegates from Virginia introduce a plan which is known as the Virginia Plan. It is presented by the governor of Virginia, a man named Edmund Randolph, and this is a plan that is meant to replace the Articles of Confederation. So, pay attention to that wording. The purpose of this plan is to replace the Articles. This is not a plan to fix the Articles. They want to completely replace the Articles of Confederation. It calls for a bicameral legislature. This means a legislature with two houses, kind of like the British Parliament. It has the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And in order for a law to be created, it has to be approved by both houses. They also want representation based on population. They think that the bigger a state's population is, the more lawmakers it should get to send to the legislature. A few other things that you should know about the Virginia Plan: it called for two other branches to be added, the executive branch and the judicial branch. They thought it was important that the court system be separate from the other branches of government. And it also called for the lower house of the legislature to be elected by the people and the upper house of the legislature to be elected by the state legislatures. Later on, about a month later into the convention, William Patterson, who was one of the delegates from New Jersey, introduced the New Jersey Plan. Now, this was a plan to revise the Articles. So basically what New Jersey is saying is we don't want to completely get rid of the Articles of Confederation. We just want to change a few things in them. Now, this plan calls for a unicameral legislature, which means it only has one house, and it calls for equal representation. So New Jersey is a fairly small state, and it does not think it's fair, or it doesn't think that representation based on population is very fair. So it wants equal representation. It thinks that every state should get one vote, which is basically how the Confederation Congress worked under the Articles of Confederation. On June 19th, 1787, the delegates voted, they put the two plans up to a vote. They had to decide, what are we going with? Are we going with the Virginia Plan or the New Jersey Plan? And ultimately, they voted to go with the Virginia Plan. So after June 19th, which was about a month into the convention, the goal became not to change the Articles, but to replace the Articles and write an entirely new Constitution. Now, the author of the Virginia Plan was James Madison. And since this new Constitution that's going to be written is based on his model, he is remembered as the father of the Constitution. And that is something that he is still remembered as to this day.